Welcome, everyone, to Latinxs Computer Science and our first talk, presented by Dr. Judson Brewer MD PhD. The name of the talk is called How to Use Novel Discoveries in Neuroscience on How to Improve Well-Being and Habits. Jud Brewer MD PhD, Dr. Jud is a thought leader in the field of habit change and the science of self-mastery, having combined over 20 years of experience with mindfulness training with his scientific research therein. He is the Director of Research and Innovation at the Mindfulness Center and Associate Professor in the Behavior and Social Science and Psychiatry at the School of Public Health and Medicine at Brown University. He's also a research affiliate at MIT, a psychiatrist, and internationally known expert in mindfulness training for addictions. Brewer has developed and tested novel mindfulness programs for habit change, including both in-person and app-based treatments for smoking, emotional eating, and anxiety. He has also studied the underlying neural mechanisms of mindfulness using standard and real-time fMRI and EEG neurofeedback. He has trained U.S. Olympic athletes and coaches, foreign government ministers, and his work has been featured on 60 Minutes, TED Talk, fourth most viewed talk of 2016 with 14 plus million views, the New York Times, Time Magazine, Top 100 New Health Discoveries of 2013, Forbes, BBC, NPR, Al Jazeera documentary about his research, Business Week, and others. His work has been funded by the National Institute of Health, American Heart Association, among others. Dr. Brewer founded Mind Sciences to move his discoveries of clinical evidence behind mindfulness for anxiety, eating, smoking, and other behavior changes into the hands of consumers. For more info, you can see www.drjud.com to get access to this. He is also the author of The Craving Mind, From Cigarettes to Smartphones to Love, Why We Get Hooked and How We Can Break Bad Habits. Fabulous book that I've read at least 3 times. Highly recommended. You can follow him on Twitter at Jud Brewer. Now, thank you, and I hope you enjoy this fantastic opportunity to have someone as hardworking and as brilliant as Dr. Brewer presenting us on how to use novel discoveries in neuroscience on how to improve well-being and habits. Thank you, everyone.
What might be helpful for you. So happy to keep this interactive. What I'd like to do is also, I'm going to turn off the chat function for now. I know there can be a tendency to have side chats in Zoom conferences. I just want to minimize the tendencies to do those things. If you do have a question during the talk that's where something needs clarification, just unmute yourself and ask, or just know that there will be plenty of time at the end to ask questions as well. So what I'll do is go ahead and get started. Give me a second to share my slides, and we'll get going. Okay. So I thought we could keep this relevant. There's certainly a lot of uncertainty going on right now, and I'm guessing with that comes a fair amount of anxiety. So I thought we could focus tonight's discussion and presentation on that. So I'll just jump right in. These are my financial disclosures. You can read them. Basically the apps, some of the app-based research that I'll be talking about here was developed by a startup company that got started when I was at Yale. I think one thing that I should also point out is, in terms of disclosures, is that I'm a white male. And for anybody, especially with the same skin color as mine, I think it's really important for all of us to really learn about what we don't know. And I found some resources really helpful. There's a book by Shakil Chaudhry. There are many other books also helpful. And then there was this fabulous podcast series called Seeing White that came out of Duke University, which really helped me see a lot of the preconceived notions and inherent biases that I've learned societally, and helped me be able to move forward from there. I'm sure we all know why this is really important, these days, but this has also been an issue for a long time. For example, there was a PNAS article that came out in 2016 showing that half of medical students and residents were still learning basically racist themed things in medical school. For example, they had the belief that Black people had thicker skin than white people. It's not true. And also a higher pain tolerance, which is also not true. And this led to them making different and unhelpful medical decisions. So this is very alive and alive today. And I think it's really important that all of us educate ourselves to help reduce this type of bias. I thought I would start with a case study from a patient that I've been seeing in my clinic. This was a patient that was referred to me for anxiety. The reason I'm showing you a picture of cars on a highway was that when he first walked into my office, he described how he would have panic attacks while driving on the highway. He said he felt like he was in a speeding bullet and that he was going to get in an accident. And these panic attacks became so strong that he couldn't even drive on the highway anymore. In fact, he was visibly shaken just driving a few miles to my office. The other thing that I noticed right upon him walking in the door was that he was very overweight, and we'll see why that is relevant in a minute. So, what are the current treatments for anxiety, for obesity? As an example, benzodiazepines are only recommended for 2 to 4 weeks for acute anxiety, and antidepressants are the current gold standard treatment for anxiety because we don't really have a great handle on how these things work. So what I would suggest is, that we haven't actually spent a lot of time really exploring how our minds work. I can give a personal example. I had panic attacks during residency training, so there's a personal example. But also, when I was trying to learn how to meditate, I would, sit on week-long silent retreats, sweating through t-shirts in the middle of winter because I was trying to force myself to meditate so much. So there was something there that I was missing, and I would also argue there's something there that we're all missing in terms of, trying to approach issues like anxiety and other unhealthy behaviors like overeating in today's society. And what I would suggest is that, taking from a quote that was attributed to Einstein, though I'm not sure that he actually said it, no problem can be solved with the same level of consciousness that created it. And what this suggests is, for example, we use things like, willpower to try to change behavior. And that relies, if it is even true, willpower itself relies on the prefrontal cortex, which is the youngest and weakest part of our brain from an evolutionary perspective. It's the first that goes offline when we get stressed out. So using something that goes offline when we get stressed for stress may not be that helpful. And that suggests that we haven't actually looked carefully enough at how our brains and how our minds work. So I'm going to show you a short animation that kind of outlines, how this system works in terms of, the fear system being helpful for survival, and also in current, right now during this pandemic, how this can go awry. So I'm going to show you this short animation. Somebody just speak up if the audio doesn't work, but it should work with this.
Anxiety gone viral. Why fear and uncertainty spread anxiety through social contagion, and how to protect yourself. Anxiety is a strange beast. As a psychiatrist, I've learned that anxiety and its close cousin panic are both born from fear. As a behavioral neuroscientist, I know that fear's main evolutionary function is helping us survive. In fact, fear is the oldest survival mechanism we've got. Fear helps us learn to avoid dangerous situations in the future through a process called negative reinforcement. For example, if we step out into a busy street, turn our head and see a car coming right at us, we instinctively jump back onto the safety of the sidewalk. Evolution made this really simple for us. So simple that we only need 3 elements in situations like this to learn: an environmental cue, a behavior, and a result. In this case, walking up to a busy street cues us to look both ways before crossing. The result of not getting killed helps us remember to repeat the action again in the future. Sometime in the last million years, humans evolved a new layer on top of our more primitive survival brain, called the prefrontal cortex. Involved in creativity and planning, the prefrontal cortex helps us think and plan for the future. It predicts what will happen in the future based on past experience. If we don't have enough information, our prefrontal cortex lays out different scenarios about what might happen next and guesses which will be most likely. It does this by running simulations based on previous events that are most similar. Enter anxiety. Anxiety is defined as a feeling of worry, nervousness, or unease, typically about an imminent event or something with an uncertain outcome. Anxiety comes up when our prefrontal cortices don't have enough information to accurately predict the future. We saw this with the novel coronavirus that was discovered in China at the end of 2019, COVID-19. Scientists race to study the characteristics of any new virus so that we can know precisely how contagious and deadly it is, and act accordingly. Uncertainty abounds. Without accurate information, it is easy for our brains to spin stories of fear and dread. In addition to being fueled by uncertainty, anxiety is also contagious. In psychology, the spread of emotion from one person to another is termed social contagion. Our own anxiety can be cued or triggered simply by talking to someone else who is anxious. Their fearful words are like a sneeze landing directly on our brain, emotionally infecting our prefrontal cortex and sending it out of control as it worries about everything from whether our family members will get sick to how our jobs will be affected. Wall Street is a great example of social contagion. We watch the stock market spike and crash, the stock indices being a thermometer for how feverish our collective anxiety is at any one moment. Wall Street even has something known as the Fear Index, which with coronavirus outstripped the financial meltdown of 2008. When we can't control our anxiety, that emotional fever spikes into panic. Panic is defined as sudden, uncontrollable fear or anxiety, often causing wildly unthinking behavior. Overwhelmed by uncertainty and fear of the future, the rational thinking parts of our brains go offline when we're panicked. Logically, we know that we don't need a 6-month supply of toilet paper, but when we see someone else's cart piled high, their anxiety infects us, and we go into survival mode. So how do we not panic? Too many times I've seen my anxious clinic patients try to suppress or think themselves out of anxiety. Unfortunately, both willpower and reasoning rely on the prefrontal cortex, which isn't available at these critical moments. Instead, I start by teaching them how their brain works, so that they can see how uncertainty weakens the brain's ability to deal with stress, priming it for anxiety when fear hits. But this is only the first step. To hack our brains and break the anxiety cycle, we need to become aware of 2 things. 1, that we are getting anxious or panicking, and 2, what the result is. This helps us see if our behavior is actually helping us survive, or in fact moving us in the opposite direction. Panic can lead to impulsive behaviors that are dangerous, and anxiety has near and long-term consequences both mentally and physically. Once we are aware of how unrewarding anxiety is, we can then deliberately bring in the bigger, better offer. Since our brains will choose more rewarding behaviors simply because they feel better, we can practice replacing old habitual behaviors such as worry with those that are naturally more rewarding. These are the bigger, better offers. For example, if we notice that we have a habit of touching our face, we can be on the lookout for when we act out that behavior. At that moment, we can step back and notice if we're starting to worry. Oh no, I touched my face. Maybe I'll catch something. And instead of panicking, we can take a deep breath and ask ourselves, when was the last time I cleaned my hands? Just by taking a moment to pause and ask the question, we give our prefrontal cortex a chance to come back online and do what it does best. Think. Oh, right, I just washed my hands. Here we can leverage certainty. If we've just washed our hands and haven't been out in public, the likelihood that we're going to get sick is pretty low. The more we can see the positive feeling and effects of good hygiene and compare them to the negative feeling of uncertainty or getting caught up in anxiety, the more our brains naturally move toward the former. Because it feels better, they naturally choose the bigger, better offer. How do I know this? My lab has studied these mechanisms for decades. We've recently found that simple mindfulness training, delivered through an app called Unwinding Anxiety, can reduce anxiety by 57% in a study that we did with anxious physicians. In a second study with people with generalized anxiety disorder, we saw that anxiety went down by 63% in just a couple of months. Understanding these simple learning mechanisms will help all of us keep calm and carry on, which is how London dealt with the uncertainty of constant air raids in World War II. As we keep calm and carry on, this helps us keep from getting caught in anxiety or panic whenever we face uncertainty. When our prefrontal cortex comes back online, we can compare anxiety to what it feels like to be calm. To our brains, it's a no-brainer. It simply takes a little practice so that the bigger, better offer becomes our new habit.
Okay, so hopefully that
Anxiety gone viral.
not what we wanted. So just to recap that, we've got two brain systems, this old brain that's helps us survive. That's where the fear mechanisms come in. And this new brain that's involved in thinking and planning. And that's actually how all habitual behavior gets set up, is through this old brain as compared to the new brain. You can think of this as, these survival mechanisms where hunger triggers us to eat, which leads to the reward, this dopamine signal coming from our stomach to our brain that says, remember what you ate and where you found it. And in fact, the same mechanisms at play for helping us avoid danger. You see danger, you run away, you live to survive for another day. And in fact, habits can get set up in the same way, where if we're stressed out and we learn to eat as a way to avoid that unpleasant feeling of stress, we can start to learn to eat based on emotion rather than actual physiologic hunger. And in fact, anxiety can be learned as a habit loop as well. There's been a fair amount of work dating back to the 1980s showing that unpleasant emotions like fear can trigger worry thinking, which then makes us feel more in control, which is that rewarding property. The problem is that as we start to realize that the worry thinking itself doesn't feel very good, that reward reduces. And when we realize that we're not actually in that much control when we're worrying, it just is giving us something to do, that worry can start to spiral back on itself and feed future anxiety. So as I mentioned in that little animation, we've done a fair amount of research to see what can actually break these cycles of anxiety. And this is where mindfulness training comes in. Many of you may have heard of mindfulness training. I'd like the simple definition of mindfulness that comes from Jon Kabat-Zinn's work, where he talks about paying attention on purpose in the present moment, non-judgmentally. And really what this does is help us see when we're starting to get caught up in habitual behaviors, and instead of holding on to pleasant behaviors like overeating or stress eating, or pushing away unpleasant things like trying to get rid of anxiety through worrying, we can actually learn to be with all of these things rather than habitually react to them. And I won't go through all the details of the research that we've done, but just to give you a sense for how well mindfulness can actually target some of these mechanisms. This is the study of the anxious physicians, where we got a 57% reduction in clinically validated anxiety scores at 3 months with them in a single arm trial. And then in a randomized control trial that we completed more recently with people with generalized anxiety disorder, you can see that there's a pretty specific decrease in anxiety symptoms in the active group, whereas the folks that just got usual clinical care, they dropped their anxiety by about 15%, but it wasn't nearly as significant as the folks that got the app-based mindfulness training. So what this suggests is that if we really focus on the mechanisms and understand how the mind works, we can actually start to work with our minds, and mindfulness training is a great way to do this. Now, just to kind of summarize this part, we tend to go to external behaviors to alleviate negative emotions. For example, we eat, we worry, we smoke cigarettes, we do whatever. These give us brief relief and also perpetuate the cycle. What mindfulness actually can uniquely do is help us rely on something that we have inherently available, something that's internal to all of us, which is curiosity. As Lewis Carroll put it in Alice in Wonderland, she exclaims, "Curiouser and curiouser." And what I would suggest is that we can actually substitute curiosity for these other behaviors and get curious about what anxiety feels like, what cravings feel like, what our thoughts are, what our emotions are. And instead of getting pushed or pulled by them, we can just simply curiously observe them. And through that, we can learn that we don't have to habitually react to them, which can lead to a more sustained relief. Just to give you an example of this, this is somebody using our Unwinding Anxiety program. This person said, when I first started the program, I didn't quite buy into the benefits of curiosity. Today, I felt a wave of panic. And instead of immediate dread or fear, my automatic response was, that's interesting. That took the wind right out of its sails. I wasn't just saying it was interesting, I actually felt it. So this really helps us see that when we can tap into our inherent ability to be curious, and we can talk about the different types of curiosity if folks are interested, but this natural ability to be curious can help us work with really significant things like anxiety. So I'll just finish this formal part of the talk by telling you how my patient did. Obviously, if he didn't do well, I would use him as an example. What I suggested that he do after our first visit was to go out and map out some of his anxiety habit loops, to what's the trigger, what's the behavior, what's the result of that, and then come back 2 weeks later and tell me what he had discovered. The idea here is if we can understand how our minds work, we can then start to work with them. So that was the first step. Well, he came back 2 weeks later and he sat down in the chair and he said, hey, Doc, I lost 15 pounds or 14 pounds or something like that. And I looked at him because I was a little confused. I thought we were actually focusing on anxiety. And he said, well, I mapped out those habit loops and I realized that I was eating as a response to being anxious, and it wasn't actually helping me be less anxious. So I stopped doing that. Over the course of the next 6 months, he lost close to 100 pounds, simply by bringing this awareness in and bringing in some mindfulness practices. And he also went from being, having panic attacks when he was on the highway and avoiding driving altogether to literally, and I kid you not, becoming an Uber driver. So this just kind of highlights how much control we have and how much power we have just simply through understanding how our minds work and how just that awareness of the process can help us tap into the system, utilize our natural capacity to be curious, and actually change pretty significant health behaviors. So what I'll do is I'll finish by just summarizing all of this. It turns out we actually do know a whole lot about how our minds work. We just haven't in the past been utilizing, these mechanistic understandings. And in fact, simply bringing awareness to these habit loops can actually help us affect significant change. So I will stop there. Certainly, I've got a bunch of resources if you want to learn more about this stuff or learn about everyday addictions, etc., on my website. We also have mindfulness resources at the Mindfulness Center at Brown. Or if nothing else, you can just remember Mary Oliver, her instructions for living, which are to pay attention, be astonished, and tell about it. So I will stop there, and maybe we can start by, I'll just answer any clarification questions or questions about the presentation.